to hear from. Lots of stuff to get through today, so I'm going to make a slow start on the assumption that people will keep drifting in. So thank you so much all for making time, finding your way to this obscure corner of the second floor to hear from this wonderful panel today. So we are putting our heads together to understand what the last year has looked like, this year of unthinkable violence, this year of sweeping funding cuts, of the politicization of aid, of loss of public support for the humanitarian project, UN reprioritization. What has all that looked like from the community perspective? And here to help me figure that out, we have an all-star panel. We have Nadine Saba, who is the head of the Akar Network for Development based in Lebanon. We have Federico Motka, who's with the Vitol Foundation. We have Gloria Soma, who leads the Titi Foundation in South Sudan. And we have Lucy Fuentes from the START Network. And we today, if I can make the clicker work, we today are going to put our heads together on three big questions. We're going to ask, what are communities in crisis telling us about the impacts of aid cuts on them, their lives, their livelihoods, their hopes for the future? And how aligned are the prioritization choices that the UN-led system has made with what communities themselves prioritize? And then thirdly, which started as a bit of a side question in this research, but has kind of become the central question, as the formal aid system shrinks, what is happening to the broader aid ecosystem? And Federico and Gloria are going to talk us through how they both see that from their perspectives. I'm going to be drawing on all of the data that Ground Truth Solutions collected last year. We spoke to more than 14,000 people across 10 countries. We topped that up by key informant interviews with a bunch of global, local, and national research leaders and NGOs. So I'm going to rattle you through all of that data, which is coming out in a report that should be ready to go next week. I'm happy to share with all of you in the room. I'll run through very quickly what that looks like from our data, and then I'll hand over to our panel to talk about how that all looks from there. So 2025, as you don't need me to tell any of you, was this extraordinary year of violence, of rupture, of cuts, of reprioritization, and the dust is nowhere close to settling. So we're trying to figure out what's going on the fly a little bit here. When we look at our data from across 10 countries, a pretty similar picture emerges to what we've seen for the last several years. So aid is generally quite misaligned with people's priorities. In many situations, in many instances, aid misses the most vulnerable people. And aid does not do a great job at supporting communities' own initiatives and supporting communities' hopes for their futures. What's very clear is that this is all exacerbated by aid cuts. A smaller version of the existing system really isn't working for anyone. What we've heard loud and clear is that rather than just shrinking, rather than just retreat, people want to see reimagination. People want to see us address these big challenges. So to be very clear, we did not design our research in 2025 to systematically capture the impact of aid cuts. Some of that data was collected too early. It's not the question that we asked, but as we look across our data and as we talk to key informants across the piece, 6 key things jump out. So the first thing to say is when we spoke to communities in the immediate aftermath of aid cuts, the very first impacts we saw were on food security and health. There's this terrible story from Somalia. We heard similar things from Sudan, from Afghanistan, from many of the countries in which we work, but the immediate impact on health and on food security, and that's continued. The other immediate impact, which continues, is on trust. So NGOs, in many cases, aid providers disappeared overnight without communicating to communities what was happening, what they could expect. And these, in many cases, were organizations that had built that trust over years. What we heard loud and clear is that that trust is going to take a long time to rebuild. We heard from people how they were moving from thriving, from thinking about quality of life, to being pushed right back into survival mode. And this quote from Gaza, I think, emphasizes the long-term impacts that cuts to education, for example, are likely. We heard how people are being pushed into more harmful coping mechanisms, and we've all seen that in your own work. We heard fears about increasing insecurity, about how aid cuts are going to push people to consider rejoining armed groups. And we heard that this isn't just about money. Alongside the funding cuts has been this squeezed political space for aid, the politicization of aid, and we've seen that across the world, but perhaps nowhere more clearly than Gaza. So thinking about humanitarian prioritization, I need to say a few things. So first of all, we recognise that funding cuts have led to impossible decisions. We realise these impossible life and death decisions are not easy. We also recognise that this is essentially an OCHA-led exercise. It does not by any means define all of humanitarian aid, but it will have a significant impact across the piece. It's also true that the impacts of this prioritisation and what prioritisation really means are not yet clear. So with that in mind, we looked across 8 key community priorities that have come out of almost every conversation we've had this year. And we've tried to understand where those align with or where those are misaligned with what we understand about prioritization decisions that are happening. So we picked out 8 priorities. Let me run you through them very quickly. So the first one is on reaching the right people. This, as every year, is a little bit of a mixed picture, but there are certainly contexts in which people say loud and clear aid and services are not reaching the people that need them most. We hear in particular how we're missing older people, we're missing people living with disabilities, and we're missing children living without parents. Issues around aid fairness this year, as often, came out loud and clear. That includes targeting that feels arbitrary, targeting that prioritizes one group over another, increases tensions within the community. And we also heard lots and lots of instances of corruption, gatekeeping, misappropriation of aid from across countries. What's clear is that aid cuts take hold and prioritization tightens the frame. We risk making vulnerable people invisible and by missing even more of the most vulnerable people. Second, on delivering the right assistance. So here as well, we see a mixed picture. And when you zoom into the country level, we've picked Gaza here, but we could do this with many of the countries that we work in. You see a really clear mismatch between what people prioritize the most and the assistance that they're receiving. We heard really broad calls for cash, people prioritizing cash in almost every country that we work in. And cash has had a bumpy road this year, I understand. And we know that a back to basics package of assistance that's narrower, that's less predictable, is going to make that mismatch even more acute. So number 3, again, one of the biggest issues that we heard in every conversation this year was how people want support to escape the precarious situations they're in, to escape aid dependency, to become self-sufficient, to pursue their priorities and goals. Humanitarian aid has never done well here, but I think what we're hearing this year is that people are really focused on aid, which helps them support future autonomy. People feel really clear that the humanitarian system needs to help them in that journey. And as resilience and recovery are cut, fall off the agenda, this gap is widening. Number 4, support that addresses climate impacts. I think climate impacts for everyone we speak to are increasingly clear. People refer to them as overwhelming, they're unable to cope. People are laser focused on adapting their livelihoods, adapting the way they make a living to cope with the climate crisis. And they say that humanitarian aid doesn't help them to do that. People want upstream investments in the things that stop climate hazards turning into climate disasters. And as we know, all of that funding, all of that tentative progress that we've seen has been taken off the table this year. Here, communities driving decision making. So early in the reset, we heard these really promising, really loud promises to make sure that everything that we do, all prioritization, is driven by communities in crisis. I think it's fair to say that those promises have absolutely fallen off the agenda in the year since. This is not a very positive picture that we see. Very few people say that there are opportunities for them to participate in the decisions that affect them. We see egregious examples across countries of where, as in this case in the Central African Republic, of what happens when aid is delivered at random, when aid is delivered without engaging the communities it's meant to serve. And we also hear really constructive suggestions from communities we work with for how they would like to do that differently. When we talk to CSOs, to civil society, what we hear is that while community engagement is being done more on paper, in reality, the sense is that we go to communities with our minds already made up. This is a tick box exercise to validate what we already want to do, and that communities know and feel that. And I think it's very obvious that if we go down this route of prioritization without listening, we're going to exacerbate those mismatches, exacerbate that waste, and we're going to silence really important. Number 6, how is humanitarian aid supporting communities' own efforts? So we all know that community self-help, mutual aid is the first line of response in any crisis. And we see how aid scarcity, aid cuts, protracted crises are pushing this solidarity to breaking point in many, many places. We hear how those community-led initiatives are not supported, not recognised well enough by humanitarian aid. And we also hear from some quarters, and I think we'll pose the question to both Gloria and Federico today, that the shrinking of the UN-led aid system is leading to an acceleration and expansion of mutual aid efforts to fill that gap. On localization, you will hear this in many, many panels this week, so I won't labour the point, but I think what we're seeing is outsourcing, not localization. Aid cuts have forced a transfer of activities, a transfer of risk, but not a transfer of power. Local actors are saying they see increased competition with international actors, and they're calling for a different relationship, one of complementarity. Local actors have also told us loud and clear they're not aware of, they're not involved in the prioritization decisions that have been made. And then finally, addressing the root causes of crisis. So I know humanitarian aid is not for this. Humanitarian aid has never done this. It's not on humanitarian actors to solve conflicts, but I would be remiss in not reflecting the loudest message that we've heard from every country in conflict today, which is if the international community does one thing, stop this war, protect our rights, help to keep us and our families safe. And we see in many, many situations that what people want, what people are prioritizing is nothing to do with what humanitarian actors can deliver. It is safety, it is keeping my family safe, ensuring security, having enough peace that I can go and farm my fields. So while I'm not saying this is on humanitarian actors, we also can't pretend that we operate in a political vacuum. We need to engage. So what does this all add up to, and what do people we talk to look at when we ask them what gives them optimism? I think it's this. So community-led response has always been predominant, but these cuts coming after COVID have really highlighted the fragility of this UN-led system. They've really shown communities that this system is not something that can be trusted over the long term. Communities have started to look elsewhere. They've started to look for different funding sources, different sources of support. They've started to be perhaps more organized in the way that they call for specific types of support. And across the people we've spoken to, there is a sense that people find optimism in this future aid system, which is more of an ecosystem, more modular, more local, and more interoperable. So we now have this opportunity, I think, to work towards this new system, this new interoperable system in a more intentional way. The question for us, I think, is how can we work differently and in a broader coalition to support the most vulnerable people to survive and to build stable futures in a world on fire? With that small question, I turn to my esteemed panel members. So Nadine, we're going to start with you to think about the impact of aid cuts. So looking across the region that you work in, looking across the Middle East, how do you see the impacts of aid cuts and prioritization decisions for the communities that you serve? And how has that money problem intersected with the politics? How's that intersected with the politicization of aid as you see it?
Thank you. Actually, the money problem or the shortage of funding, I believe, has been a magnifying lens that showed the fragility of the system. In the sense that at one point, we first thought, well, it's, as others have labeled it, it's a liquidity crunch, while it's not. It's a structural flaw that has been displaying through the aid cuts and through the money problem. So if I look into the manifestation of this crisis, I would say that when we're looking into the money problem, we're looking into the first layer of the problem. The problem goes deeper, and we're not going into the heart of it, whether consciously or subconsciously, I'm not sure. If I want to look into the impacts, and when we first start looking into the impact, we think about the sectors. So I could tell you, yes, health was affected, yes, protection was affected, education was affected, but the most important thing that is affected is the trust. And people, when they are in crisis, they want to trust the people who are providing services to them. And they wanted to trust the system, and they want to trust the system. But what happened throughout this year has shaken this trust. Because what happened throughout this year is the system is literally telling the assets of its survival. In the sense that we want the people, you've said, that we're looking more into the future autonomy, resilience and recovery, avoiding aid dependency, making sure that the people have more agency. And what did we do in the past year? And not only in the past year, in the past years. Actually, what did we do? In the past years, we did not do much of it. What we have been doing is band-aiding and rather trying to look on the other way. What local and national actors have been talking and saying a lot is solve the conflict. Actually, and go to the root of the conflict. Actually, what is happening now is doing it, but in a different way, not in the way we intended to. We were saying that what's generating crisis is this geopolitical intervention. And what is happening now is things are clearer. Previously, and I had a discussion earlier with a colleague, previously, what used to be said is that we have a certain rules-based order and we have certain principles that we're abiding with whenever we're providing aid. What is happening at the moment is that donors are being clear. Donors are clearer and are more honest. They are saying, some of them, we're putting aid money where it is serving our interests. Don't you think that this was also the case previously, but it wasn't said out loud? And this is where I think the trust is being shaken. For me, I believe, and I remember that when I first heard about, the stop work orders, I was angry first and foremost against my own government. I was angry first and foremost against my government, my elected people, my parliament that has led us to a point where we are having this aid dependency. And this is where I think we need to relook into the aid system and the ecosystem at all. I've come across the futures of aid, the future of aid scenarios, and we've seen different scenarios. And in one of the scenarios, it is said, and I think I will go back to that, it is talking about, empires of aid, where aid becomes a geopolitical instrument of competing powers. NGOs operate under tighter control, serving rival blocs' interests. And my question is, aren't we already in this scenario? Is it different than the reality that we're seeing? And at the same time, what are we doing? We're just hyper-prioritizing. Hyper-prioritizing, as much as it is needed at the moment, will have bad impacts on the longer term, because it is not being coupled with another alternative of pushing people towards being more autonomous. The problem is, at the moment, we're doing one path without really thinking about the nexus, without really involving other partners, without reaching out to the private sector, without trying to do some work where people are, while suffering the impact of aid, they are still surviving and trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel. This is where I think the problem is. This is where the issue of trust is at the core, because we have been asking, local and national actors are on both spectrum. We're part of the community, but we're also part of the system. And we have been trying to encourage communities to trust the system. And what do we get? We and the communities. Sometimes we just get lip service in terms of localization. As you have rightly said, localization has been thought of outsourcing. What we have been saying is the following. Localization has been marketed as cheaper and has been implemented as changing the person who's delivering the services. It has not been implemented in the sense of shifting the modality of viewing aid, the modality of thinking about aid and about delivering aid. We're still at the aid delivery. We did not go to the decision taking, to the power place. So this is where I think communities are feeling it. Yes, they are feeling it because we are feeling it. And the trust here is essential, because when people lose the trust, they will not obey. And when they don't trust the system anymore, we cannot be surprised if we have different negative coping behavior that are emerging between the communities, because they are losing the trust in the system. So if I want to go back to your question, they intersect in the way we are also looking to the community, because this is the also underlying root. We are thinking towards a community that is affected by a crisis as the others. And this is a question for you in terms of climate change. Who is the community affected? Aren't we? So why don't we look towards aid with the same lens? I'll repeat that. We have learned nothing about COVID. Throughout COVID, it was, we're not safe until we're all safe, and we forgot that. At the moment, it's, I am safe, everybody can do whatever they want.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. There's lots there to dig into. Going to turn next to Lucy to ask, how does the direction of travel of humanitarian assistance that you've seen, all of the changes that Nadine's talked about, that we've heard about from the reset, how does that align with the priorities of the communities that you work with and hear from?
Start by saying that I work for an organization called START Network. And START Network is a network of NGOs. We've got around 140 network members, both international as well as local and national network members are in the room. And it is those network members who serve the communities and have that direct relationship with communities. So a lot of what I will share is what the network members have shared with us. But I think it's really interesting, and maybe picking up from Dean's point. START Network began its life some 15, 16 years ago, and it was a group of NGOs that came together, tired of complaining about the problems that are inherent to the humanitarian system. And way back then, they were complaining about aid is slow. It often comes in long after the crisis has actually happened, if it's too late. The decisions that get taken around where that aid goes to tend to be taken in closed rooms in the global north, in European cities, American cities. And the decisions are very often, if not always, driven by the political agendas, driven by the media headlines. And it strikes me, just picking up from what you were saying, that we're still in that space. Things really haven't changed much. In fact, you're just now sort of, I guess, seeing it explicit. You're seeing it sort of bare. And I would also go so far as to say what we're seeing is not necessarily positive humanitarian system changes we would like to, as we would hope to see, which is sort of more of a locally led humanitarian system, more of a proactive humanitarian system. We've seen this perverse system change happening over years now. And I think the situation, the attacks on Gaza, the genocide in Gaza is just one example of how the system is failing the people that it's here to serve first and foremost. Just going back to my actual notes here for a moment, in the context of the funding cuts, and I think, again, picking up what you've already shared, but most NGOs were affected by the funding cuts, but local and national organizations were affected worse by the funding cuts. So we know that local and national organizations, generally speaking, have less access to unrestricted funding. In the past, we've had programs, including sort of the former DFID program that gave money for core costs. That's long gone. Many local national organizations are unable to raise funds from sort of the public in their particular geography, so they're very much beholden to the money that they receive as sub-grantees, as partners, as downstream partners of the INGOs, of the UN agencies, and of the other actors. And that means they don't have a cushion. They can't invest in reserves. They can't invest in sort of ensuring that they are sort of healthy, resilient organizations. So when the funding cuts come, there's very little for them to fall back on. They're really just worst affected. And yet we know in nearly every crisis, those communities and the community-based organizations, the NGOs, are at the forefront. They're always first. They're always responding way before the international actors typically come in. And what we've often seen, I think about the 2022 Pakistan floods, we know that when the big system sort of does hit, when we do have sort of funding surge in and we have international actors surge in, those local actors are often crowded out. So you've seen it play out so many times. I think we're just seeing sort of that happening sort of in longer time, and it's just much more painful. After the funding cuts, we surveyed the network members of START, and that was sort of the story that it told. And given that we work with pool funds and many other pool funds are doing something a little bit similar, we were looking at sort of how do we use the resourcing we have to assist those organizations that we work with. And we opened something called the Solidarity Fund. And it was really meant to enable the network members to continue to program, to continue to operate, but also to try to sort of see them through a period so that they could fundraise, so that they could, I guess, sort of maintain their operations. And those projects that we received through the Solidarity Fund were really horrifying, frankly. Some of the ones that I looked at were organizations in places like Myanmar and places like Zimbabwe, HIV and AIDS programs, child protection programs, and there were entire caseloads of humans, very vulnerable humans, that had been receiving assistance that had suddenly overnight vanished. And organizations are writing to us and saying, we want to be able to maintain the support to this caseload of people who depend upon it. And the big question that we were grappling with was, we can provide an injection of funding for right now, but what happens in the longer term? Ideally, those caseloads of people would be part of the government's social protection systems. So it was really impossible choices and no easy solution. And I sort of come back again to what you were saying about it. It's like plasters. We're just sort of sticking plasters over these gaping wounds. It feels at times impossible. Just coming back to the question, Sophie, sorry. But also, I think anticipatory action is quite key. And I think you look back now at the past sort of decade or two and you realize they were almost the boom years for the humanitarian system. And there were advances that were made in some areas, anticipatory action perhaps being one of those areas. And again, this is something that local communities will always do, right? If there is a crisis that is taking place, they will typically know the signs, know the signals, know that something is coming, whether it's a climate-related crisis or whether it's displacement or something related to conflict. And they will try to take precautionary measures. They will try to mitigate the impacts of that crisis. And the international humanitarian community has recognized the importance of acting early, recognized that there's science that could support with that, maybe overlooked somehow that there's also local indigenous traditional knowledge that could also be used to build into those systems. But there is funding that's now available for anticipatory action, which is able to sort of respond and enable those community members to act on the signals, the signs of something happening much, much better. And it got a mention in the reset, but it didn't get a huge mention in the reset. And I think if we're dealing with a humanitarian system that is dwindling, that has lesser resource in it, we have to think about like, what is an economical way of managing the money that we do have. Acting ahead of time, enabling people to act ahead of time is the logical choice. But it's really difficult when you have so many situations that need immediate attention and funding right now to invest that money in something that we expect could happen. There's a forecast it might happen. You need to really sort of balance out the competing demands. I think the other thing, maybe just to sort of acknowledge, and I appreciated you bringing in the pandemic as an example, communities have seen international actors come and go before. It isn't new. Trust has been something that we've been struggling with for the longest time. In the pandemic, many international staff left, and many local actors were at the forefront of the pandemic response, incredibly bravely at that time. Like nobody knew the implications accommodations for those frontline workers, and they remained there when many of the likes of me were not. You look at somewhere like Afghanistan, and we know that it was only in 2021 that the international community broadly left Afghanistan, and there were very few local actors that remained and continued to provide assistance to people that were incredibly vulnerable at that time. I think the funding cuts now, it has implications obviously for like what international actors will be able to do in future. But I think something that we're seeing a lot is the competition for resourcing is now so high. And even within our funds, you know, our international members need the resourcing or feel that they need that resourcing. So the amount of funding that we're actually channeling to local national actors through our funds at the moment is actually becoming lesser and lesser. So that means we have to change the way that we're operating in order for us to sort of recalibrate. And how do we ensure that this ecosystem isn't, yeah, I guess it doesn't go back to the traditional sort of the incumbents dominating and the local national actors again losing out, because at the end of the day we know that the communities, and we did survey them a couple of years ago, communities looked at the assistance being provided by international actors and by local actors, and generally speaking they fed back to us that the local actors, it really comes as no surprise, so it's not worth saying, but the local actors were reaching people faster and earlier. The quality and the relevance of what they were providing was felt to be better and more suitable. And the systems for accountability were felt to be fairer and more easily used. So that's what we hear from communities by our members.
Thank you so much. And you've given me the perfect segue into part 2 of the conversation, which is turning to Federico and to Gloria. We're going to look at the extent to which, if at all, this shrinking of the formal aid system has caused any changes in the broader aid ecosystem. So Federico, turning to you first. First of all, do you think there's any relationship between what's happening, what we're discussing in these halls and in the UN-led aid system, and what's happening in the broader ecosystem of support? And what's your most optimistic vision for what could be happening out there in 5 years' time?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning to everyone. Look, I think, actually, I wish I could give back time to Nadine to actually continue on the topics, because I think ultimately everything she pinpointed is fundamental to the conversation of what's happening within the aid system. I don't think it's a financial thing at all. The financial issue has accelerated the recognition that we were ultimately trying to underpin a system that we believe to be the first and last response. That's not the case at all. It never has been. And to Nadine's point, I think she made it extremely well. It's like I think the combination of the challenges to international humanitarian law, the fact that ultimately humanitarian law is out the window for all intents and purposes, and the combination of that funding shift is what's driving sort of where the system is today, which is ultimately to recognize that there isn't the money to continue maintaining what we had. And if we want to change anything, and if we want to recognize a future sort of model, that has to come back to a very simple mantra, which people who know me will have heard me say before, which is simply to say, if we accept that communities and people, humans, are the first and last responders, and we organize around that and figure out what our role is in order to support that, then we might be getting somewhere with a reset or a new model. And ultimately, it comes down to the question of like, are we creating a parallel system, or are we building something on top of the assets that do exist? I mean, even in failed states, there are assets on the ground and at local authority level sometimes. You know, I think jumping a little bit to the question around where I'm optimistic. For me, the reality of mutual aid and the survivor community-led response is the number one thing that it gives me optimism and gives me reason to hope. Primarily, though, we have to recognize that everywhere where mutual aid and sort of community-led responses have demonstrated the power, even to quite a significant scale, has been where the system has been forced to step aside, either because there's been access issues or security issues or funding cuts. I mean, fundamentally, it isn't because we've enabled it, it's because we've had to take ourselves out of the context. So we finally gave space for something to happen which has never had that opportunity. It's like it's smothering the basic impetus that will create an aid system that is fairer, faster, more responsive, and ultimately more efficient. And we've seen the evidence now in Myanmar, in Sudan, in some parts of Yemen, in some parts of Afghanistan, in Haiti. You know, all of these are contexts where we've had to step aside for one reason or another. And that's finally where we're seeing this real sort of opportunity to rise. And so I think the real question ultimately is sort of how are we going to organize around that and what is our role going to be? And, you know, unfortunately, I still think that all these conversations around pooled funds, around, more proximate intermediaries, you know, even sort of resourcing local actors, yes, sure, if those ecosystems can organize around that reality and also pass some of that decision-making power to the people who are already doing things. And that doesn't mean that we have to completely disappear by any stretch of the imagination. Mutual aid doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, if you look at the ERRs and all of the mutual aid that's happening in Sudan, it was there because there were people who were resourcing it, you know, in advance, like meaning, you know, during the revolution, and supporting with social media training, you know, all the things that are absolutely not humanitarian at all, but which now come to fruition. So the question ultimately and sort of the opportunity for the future is one which we recognize that actually it's not the humanitarian system that brings solution. It is the collaboration with development actors, with media partners, with human rights defenders, with feminist funds and feminist actors to actually sort of create, there's no other word, but ecosystems, right, that are resourced collectively. So it doesn't really matter where you put the money in, like as in who you select as a partner, if the funding is going into a space that actually recognizes that you need to, that my success is tied to the other's success. And I think we haven't seen this at all within the traditional mechanisms. I mean, to the point of this increased competition, right, that we're seeing in the funding flows, but actually where there is no money or where resources are so limited, we're actually seeing people sharing funding and saying, look, I know I don't have a lot, but I know that I can't succeed if you don't have what you need. So let's actually share it. And the reality is that that can only be done where there's flexible funding, where there's no restrictions on the funding, and that still hasn't quite caught up, right? Because ultimately, whilst there is definitely an increase in recognition by funders that we do need to have more flexible funding, you know, there's still regulations, guidelines, compliance that needs to figure itself out to sort of jump in behind it. And to that extent, pooled funds and into the local proximate intermediaries, but also sort of international intermediaries have a role to play. But I'm still not yet seeing that recognition that sort of the coordination of that needs to be completely reimagined. If we're still going to sort of think about how we can move from a sort of cluster-based coordination to an area-based coordination, for example, I think we're missing the point. We need to sort of see some form of coordination that works on different levels in mirroring to some extent each other. So like to the Sudan, I think is perhaps one of the better examples. But if the emergency response rooms are coordinating through quite sophisticated structures that are complicated, you know, some might say inefficient, but that's the result of civil society being where it is, right? So let that debate happen. You can't have everyone agreeing. There's no point in trying to get to that state. We don't even agree on things in these rooms. So like, how can we sort of build on what they are doing, think about where we sit and how we or those of you who implement, sorry, not we, because I sort of sit in my tower in London, but like, you know, those of you who are implementing, how can you coordinate in order to sort of give support to those structures and help them where they need it from a demand-led perspective, as opposed from this sort of like, okay, we can do something because that will give us the opportunity to get funding in. I mean, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but it's just sort of like, it's small nuanced changes to a demand-led system. And then we as donors and funders need to coordinate on our levels to sort of recognize what's happening, you know, across the lower sort of tiers, if you will, or the tiers in the funding flows. So, you know, my optimism is in the fact that I think we're seeing some of this happen. I think it's starting to go to a level of scale which is interesting. I mean, it's finally recognizing mutual aid and all this work is finally recognizing how diaspora funding goes into these spaces. So let's stop talking about the humanitarian gap when there is already funding that is supporting humanitarian issues that is never being counted, and start to think about how that, not appropriating it, by the way. We don't want it to come to us. It should continue going to where it's going. So that's also a critical factor. Like, we shouldn't be looking at diaspora to say, well, how do we get a little bit of that $7 trillion that's flowing around the economy to come into our work? No, it's more a question of like, okay, how do you build around it so that what that's being invested in is supported and not going to waste to some degree, right? So yeah, so that would be my sort of segue to Laura.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And I think that's the perfect segue. So thinking about Federico's optimistic vision of the future where everything, all global solidarity is organized around what communities are already doing. How would you compare that to what you see as the current state of affairs in South Sudan? Have you seen progress? And what do you think is needed to drive the kind of progress that Federico was talking about?
Great. So just to take us a little bit back, that mutual aid, in my community, we call it the wellet. So wellet is basically oil, and it's quite important in a lot of rituals where I come from. And it's always spread around to support one another in either good times or also the bad times. So going back to the concept of wellet, it has always been available within communities. It's just that, you know, we have always magnified or amplified the humanitarian architecture to become some semi-god, that without it, you know, communities can't prevail. And I think the aid cuts, to some extent, brought in the realities really of a fragmented system and the recognition that other actors were available, despite in the past these actors being alternatives, right? And so I would say in the current context, of course, as we all know, when aid cuts happen, it's about prioritizing this and leaving out that. But then we know that as a community, there are certain aspects that go beyond just priorities, and we want to keep up, you know, ensuring that it can be sustained through other methodologies internally. So where I come from, we do a lot of sharing, right? And it's sometimes in sharing food, or sometimes it's in sharing water. And so with that in mind, and looking at the research from since the Trump administration began, we've seen a lot of local organizations really strengthen the partnership with their communities even more. So I'll say we've seen a lot of engagement with or without resources available, utilizing the little that we have to be able to advance our own development agenda. And we've seen more coalitions now and interest of locally, I don't call it locally led, but for lack of better words, yes, locally led solutions come to exist. A lot of national organizations coming together. And so sometimes it beats my understanding that, you know, in the past, there was the question of capacity, local actors lack capacity. But today we see a lot of local organizations and their communities coming together to be able to move things forward. In my context, we've seen roads being constructed. We've seen water wells being you know, put together by people that in the international sphere would be deemed as inexperienced communities, or they're not water engineers, they don't have the right degrees to be able to, you know, become water engineers. But we've seen what local water engineers come to exist and supply water, you know, to communities, which is quite amazing. We've seen people that never worked within an official roads construction come to, you know, work on roads rehabilitation. Again, it comes down to, you know, what the system in the past used to tell us. Oh, this is a priority, that is not a priority. As we speak today, I was just sharing yesterday evening with some colleagues, when the world has been hyper prioritizing matters or the response in South Sudan, we've seen that as a result of that, they're always prioritizing where they can access, right? And it's quite unfortunate that in one of the locations where we work, from since the 5th, we received a letter indicating that all agencies need to evacuate because most probably the government will start an aerial bombardment in that locality. This is a locality that is hosting Sudanese refugees. It's hosting returnees, it's hosting IDPs and host communities, a population of nearly 250,000 being told to evacuate their area of origin to move to I don't know where because there's an operation that's going to happen. Ask me what is happening today. In the last 72 hours, INGOs, the UN agencies, are on UNHAS. Who is left behind? Local actors, their communities. But the beauty, again, and the thing that brings me a lot of hope is that in the midst of a 72-hour condition, we have to play quite smart with our population, but at the same time, find a workable solution on how we, work around our current status. We're seeing our colleagues move to Gambela, right, through the river. But the farthest I could do is provision of a boat, which would not be a priority in a normal humanitarian setting. In a normal humanitarian setting, with the ongoing bombardments that are happening in Akobo, a construction or a preparation of a graveyard to be able to decently bury our loved ones wouldn't be a consideration for resourcing, right? But we're doing that because it's what the community demands. So again, we see a lot of progress, I would say, with this system, and we as a community tend to own it more because we feel a part of. And I think for me, when you talk of accountability, really, I feel that is where real accountability is happening, and that's where real localization is happening. Without an intermediary, it is we, the communities, versus the world.
Thank you so much. I could listen to all of our speakers talk for at least another hour. I think we've heard some pretty earth-shattering stuff over the last 45 minutes, but I'm sure you're all itching to put some questions to our panelists. So we'll turn to you now. Please raise your hand. I'll call on you. Forgive my short-sightedness for those in the back. Any questions for any of our panelists? Louisa.
Hi, I'm Louisa. I'm independent, and I thank you all for your beautiful contributions. Although I feel like you are used to saying the same things over and over again. I want to challenge this issue of compliance. And we talk about capacity, and it's coming up time and again, that we have these requirements, governments are responsible to the taxpayers. As a European as a Swiss taxpayer, I can tell you that there is no accountability directly to those taxpayers. So I was wondering if you could deconstruct a bit those compliance requirements and where you see the biggest gains, because one of the big challenges, and we heard this morning, is that a lot of institutions see this mutual aid and survivor and community-led responses as kind of nice, smaller projects. How do we transform the thinking around that? And then my second question is to you, Federico, around the diaspora. We know that diaspora funding is huge. We know that remittances are huge. However, that can also come with strings attached. For example, if you look at the Iranian diaspora, who has the funding, it's not at all a unified support. So you could speak a bit to this question that keeps coming up also as a quote unquote risk to localize or locally led humanitarian response is going to be political or partial. I'm trying to be neutral, but I think you can see what I'm asking.
Doing a great job.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take 2 more questions and then put them to our panelists in benches. Anyone else sitting on a burning question? Yes, please.
Veronique from Group UAD. Just building on this last question, I think that the question of politics with a big P, maybe, is really something important, because the mutual aid groups in many situations are built on resistance groups. So we see this in Sudan, in Ukraine, in many contexts, in fact. And it is linked with the goals, the aim of mutual aid, which is not humanitarian. Can be survival at the stage, but it's very much linked with a political ideal, resistance, or trying to change their system, their national system, their government. And how to, I think that this is a big question for the humanitarian system, not for the mutual aid group at all. And it has to be a question for the humanitarian aid system, not for the local actors. So I don't know how to crack the nuts, because this is our problem. The fact that we can't work with, or some people say we can't work with political actors.
I think I saw one more question here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Victor Amwo, from Malawi. But I want to appreciate the presentations made. I think it's a very engaging topic. I could relate to a number of themes that have come out in the presentations. We've been on the ground for over 2 decades, so we're dealing with the cyclones, and HIV in those days is still big in our nation, gone silent across the globe. COVID, you name it, everything in there. From the very start, we've been looking at issues of local capacities. What sustains development? In our own work, we're looking at transactional development versus transformational development, versus relationships, all those kind of issues. But I wanted to ask, maybe from the presenters, wherever it might be, one big group, this is an African setting, Malawi in particular as well, is the role of faith actors in development. I was talking to a colleague yesterday, we work with one of the partners, Tiafan, that what a situation, the cyclones, back-to-back cyclones since 2019, but we realized that some of the flooding will happen at night. At that time, there's no international organization, but the local church is there, or faith actors are there. They'll be the first responders in the night, search and rescue and everything else. So just reinforcing the fact that the local players are always there. They're not going anywhere, and therefore they are responders. But yeah, maybe just to hear to what extent have people are being engaging these local players who have these local capacities. Sometimes they use their church buildings or faith buildings as evacuation centers. And I remember when one of the cyclones hit, when we were coming in, the international organization we partner with wanted to come in, then the roads were cut off. So that compounds the situation. Nobody could come in, but at least the local leaders or local churches were always there. And just to emphasize the point that if you build their capacity as frontline responders, you would have a better, more effective system. But yeah, just to hear some experiences around that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for excellent and very different questions. Maybe Nadine, if we start with you and take the questions that you want, but it would seem to make sense to start with the accountability question that Louisa asked.
I just quickly, I called Nadia.
No.
Nadine.
I am Nadine.
All
You're
right.
fine. You're good. So going back into the compliance and due diligence, again, during COVID, we've had a simplified procedure around that. And I would be curious to know if there was a lot of fiduciary risk around it, because my understanding that it was not. So whenever we're talking about compliance, one needs to ask, what are the real, issues of compliance that are required? And what are the ones that have been constructed by intermediaries in terms of, their own compliance. So I wouldn't agree more with you in terms of we have to look back into what is it really an issue of accountability towards taxpayers and what is something that have been created for I don't know why. So for me, this is a question to be asked to a lot of intermediaries, and my understanding that some of the philanthropies have been also looking into it whenever they are doing their own funding for their projects. And it goes back as well to the risk appetite, the risk aversion that we have been seeing from different intermediaries, whereas we're seeing with philanthropies a larger risk appetite. In terms of the accountability, one of the things that I've been always saying that humanitarian needs to liaise more with parliamentarians. Although you don't have a direct accountability line between the citizen towards the agency that is dispersing the funds, but we have been hearing a lot of issues around this accountability. And I believe that there is a link that has been missing in this communication channel, specifically for local and national actors, because a lot of times people know, the UNICEF, the Oxfam, the World Vision, the SAVE, they don't know Gloria's Foundation, Ludwig's Foundation, they don't know our network. And this is where it is difficult for people who might be even willing and pushing towards an improved localization process to advance that. Because we have been told that some legal impediments are putting that one. Second, because of the whole narrative around aid and around humanitarian aid, you don't know yet if public opinion is shaped by this narrative or vice versa in terms of politics. Now, I hope I answered you. In terms of mutual aid, personally, I wouldn't want to change them. I would want to leave them as is, because we also have this tendency of NGOification of everything that is working. Leave them the way they are operating. They are one of the tools within the context that communities are reverting to. Why do we need to change it? Why do we always feel that we know better than the communities? This has been done for years and decades and years. So leave it as is. Don't try to, impose a certain model on it. Leave it. If it can be scaled in different countries within different mechanisms, perfect. What I believe our role is just to put some visibility, put some light on it, to see if in other contexts something similar have been happening, if they can learn from each other, rather than us, creating and putting it into a certain model. In terms of the politics and mutual aid, I would want to challenge you on this, because I give you the example of the Beirut port explosion. It was purely helping people. It wasn't linked to an armed conflict. It wasn't linked to divergence in politics within one country. And we have seen remittances, we have seen diaspora that has been putting money even before institutional funding came here. So yes, potentially in some context, it is linked to politics and internal politics, but in other contexts, we've seen humanitarian solidarity and human solidarity at its best. And for me, the Beirut port explosion has been a perfect example of localization, where people just from whatever they have went down and helped people. And second is the people around the world. They were Lebanese and non-Lebanese who really put in money to help people on the ground. So for me, I am challenging you on that. I don't know what my other colleagues would say.
Well, let's turn next to Gloria, maybe, and also take the questions that you're interested in. Anything you have to say about the mutual aid being political, whether that's a challenge, and the role of faith actors, but take the questions as you see fit.
Okay, so I'll maybe jump on the compliance question, really. Frankly speaking, and having engaged this morning with a previous bilateral funder, the issue of compliance is just always an excuse to say no. So And for me, the big question becomes, it's a lot more healthier to have a very open conversation and tell me, Gloria, I'm not funding your organization, period, right? Instead of hiding behind compliance, hiding behind risk. And if you ask them what these risks really are, sometimes they're not even able to entail them, right? So again, that was, for me, I wouldn't be the best person to really give a proper response because I throw it back to, and I think this is majorly a problem with bilateral funders. Unlike a compliance issue, let's say within the philanthropy space. I'll give an example. We had due diligence processes with a bilateral funder, and I'll tell you it was super exhausting. 9 months of due diligence. The day I was done with it, yes, that was it. Unlike the philanthropic space, where the due diligence process is really more based on trust, what you have, and we take it and pick it up from there. If there's any support that we may need to give, then it's a question of we negotiating together, right? I tell you how we would want this to move, how we would want our capacity to be enhanced, and that's a period. But we see bilateral funders, INGOs, UN agencies trying to play more or less the same games so that, they, I think, at a sync in what they do, which I think needs to stop.
Federico, maybe we turn to you next on the diaspora funding question and anything else that.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll touch on a little bit of everything, perhaps. I mean, I think the diaspora question and that sort of notion of risk and sort of ties in with the politics. And again, I think, to Nadine's point, to Gloria's point, I struggle with the fact that ultimately the question, I throw it back to say, aren't we political too? Where is our funding coming from? Ministries of Foreign Affairs or independent departments that once existed outside of? It is inherently political. So let's accept that, recognize that we're political too, that we are attempting to put in norms and things within our organizations to mitigate the politicization. But at the end of the day, you can think you're doing as much as you want in terms of neutrality and impartiality and all of that, but you're not perceived as such. So, I think I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying let's be realistic about what it means in terms of what's happening on the ground. It is political. So ultimately, for me, the question is, and I think also to Nadine's point earlier, sort of like, what is your role, therefore, in a reality that might be political, where diaspora funding might be tied to something? But by the way, we don't know anything about diaspora funding. I've been working in informal money transfers and thinking about how money flows through those, very opaque Hawala Hundi systems, which are phenomenal, by the way, massively misunderstood. But there are only like a few people in the world who really understand how those flows are and what they're actually delivering on the ground. So let's assume for a second we don't understand diaspora funding, that we know it's reaching people, and then build around that. So my challenge would simply say, accept that we're political too, recognize that every situation is complex, and sort of ultimately define what you want to do based around where you think you have an added value within that reality. And ultimately, it'll be messy, it won't be nice and neat, and then it's up to donors and funders to sort of accept that alongside you. And that's where sort of this question of compliance, I think, for me, it's interesting because I always think where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, ultimately, we have seen funding reach mutual aid in the most complicated circumstances in Sudan at scale. And it's because the waivers were sought, guidances were ignored to some degree, because there was a bigger imperative. So, yeah, I mean, I fully accept the challenge of why this compliance is in place. Let's accept for the minute that we can't change it. But it doesn't mean that every single one of us can't have a role as intermediaries and players within like a global advocacy framework that can actually push back. But it requires consensus to some degree, and it requires sort of, for a minute, recognizing, okay, it's not about us. The demands are coming from the ground for something to happen. How do we enable it to happen? And let's absorb the risk. I think funders are happy to have that conversation. Philanthropy for sure. but philanthropy also as a way to de-risk for others. I mean, we're actively having these conversations at the moment, and there is no clear solution, but hopefully we'll get to some interoperability that sort of might achieve this. And I think, again, going back to some of these intermediate pool funds and intermediaries as a whole, like there will be an ecosystem that will evolve as a result that will enable funders to each sort of tick their compliance without having to push it through. But let's be honest, if I take the proximity to humanity model that is supporting the ERRs, by the way, it is absorbing all of the compliance risk for ERRs. None of it is being passed down. The ERRs, in their part, have created the F system, which is this reporting structure that works for them. USAID accepted it. OSHA accepts it. So don't tell me it can't be done and the compliance can't be addressed. I think the answer is that it can. Yeah, there was a point around sort of the fact that mutual aid sort of quite quickly goes from survival to other things that are not really humanitarian. I think let's learn from that. I mean, it just goes to show that we don't need a humanitarian answer to every crisis. If a community, if a mutual aid group is spending 10 minutes on their immediate needs and the other 50 minutes of their hour on everything else, then perhaps we need to recognize our support needs to be tailored as such. I don't know exactly how it would play into the sort of radical, whatever it is, prioritization discussion of this reset. I think the answer is have some funding that is available for that moment, but then make sure that you have everything else that you need to really quickly move as communities do. And then maybe the scores that you were showing might be more aligned as opposed to not. And then finally, I think there's a question around sort of this issue of diversity. I think we're quite monolithic. We're sort of, because we're trying to compete for funding, we're looking to be a little bit more, we're more similar to one another despite our differences in a sense. So I think again, go back to where you started and think about what your role is and sort of think about what added value you bring. And if there are other players already there, think about how from a demand perspective, you can play a role to support them, even if that means that you're not part of the equation. And that's sort of my challenge to the international system, to sort of really rethink, when if you're playing a sort of disintermediation role for a compliance reasoning, brilliant, go ahead. But not from as long as sort of that is allowing for the decision making, the dynamism, and also that diversity of action to happen on the ground. Because I think ultimately, if there's one thing we've learned, is we can't rely on either a monolithic funding source, but equally also a monolithic implementation structure. So mutual aid is not a silver bullet. It is one tool in our toolkit. I'm just saying let's organize around that, because at least it's more honest around where the realities are on the ground.
Thank you very much. Lucy, I'm going to stop dictating what questions people should answer. Any reflections on any of the questions from you? 2
reflections, if I can get them in. One, I'm going to come back to Victor's point. I love the fact that you mentioned faith actors. I also think it's weird that I don't often hear mention of civil defenders. And when I think about the scenes that we saw out of Gaza and how you have these people who go into these areas and pull people out of rubble, and they just effectively are humanitarians. I think it's mad that we rarely acknowledge them and all the work that they do. So I think faith actors, the civil defenders, maybe it comes back to your point about sort of the ecosystem and acknowledging that, the humanitarian umbrella is broad, and that there are multiple different actors, and we need to just maybe lose the ego a little bit and just be a bit more accepting and a bit more sort of complementary, working around all of these different actors. And I think probably the one thing that I see as sort of holding everybody together in service of the community is a sense of solidarity, and I guess with faith actors, a sense of that sort of love for one another, which ultimately comes back to the humanitarian principle of humanity. I don't want to end on compliance, but I do want to, I think it's really interesting because beyond what's already been said, I think what we're talking about with compliance is a profile And it's not risk per se. It's, do you have policies? Do you have practices? Can you tick all the different boxes? And certainly with institutional donors, there are an awful lot of boxes that need to be ticked. I think there is a tendency among intermediaries as well as sort of local actors to have to work with like the lowest common denominator. So that one donor that has a particularly high compliance expectation, we all try to sort of work around that rather than trying to recognize actually we could be working with different types of funders who maybe have a sort of greater risk appetite, and we should be sort of coalescing around that. It's interesting when you look at it through the lens of the pooled funds. And ICBA did a really interesting report, I think just last year, where they looked at risk within pooled funds and found that actually a lot of pooled fund managers, the intermediaries, are adding the compliance that actually the donors haven't asked us to do, but we've introduced it. Why have we done that? And surely we should be interrogating that and try to strip it out wherever possible. I think there's also a point about the funding cuts and this competition over collaboration issue that we've got. And Sophie said something at last year's HMPW that has stayed with me for the whole year, which is we are going to be focused. There's a risk that as actors, we start to focus on the survival of institutions over the survival of people. And I think that is so true. We're seeing so much competition and we're not working as a network. We're not working as a movement. We're not working as a collective. Multiple people in this room will be funded by those same donors that have these incredible compliance expectations. Are we leaving it to Gloria and the TT Foundation to fight the battle? Why aren't we all saying, actually, do you know what, like all of us recognize that you don't need to ask for X, Y, and Z because it doesn't add any value. We're looking at risk the wrong way. We're thinking about fiduciary risk when actually the local actors and the local humanitarians are the ones that are being killed, like incessant deaths happening. It's not the international actors anywhere near as much as it's the local actors. That is the risk. Do we have the means by which to make sure we're protecting the humanitarians on the front line? There will be some loss of funding. There's always loss of funding. International actors lose funding as well. And I'm talking about negligible loss of funding. It happens to all of us. None of us are completely immune from that. The difference is international actors can report it because they can bear the loss. They can cushion the blow of having to pay back a disallowance, whereas local actors don't have that cushion, which comes back to the funding that's available to them and their ability to be a resilient organization with a bit of cushion, with a bit of insurance. So it's almost like we're trying to give little bits of funding to local actors, holding them to this high compliance expectation, demanding that they report whenever there's an issue, but then the moment they report, which they've been asked to do, we're like, well, now you have to pay it back and it means you're going to go insolvent and da 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 da. It's this horrible cycle that we've gotten ourselves caught in, and it can be addressed if we come together. And we do it at HMPW every year. We come together, we all say the same things, and all the panels, everybody nods, we all agree, and then we go back to our offices and we focus as it's so maybe the buck needs to stop somewhere and we need to actually work as a collective.
Yeah, a great point. I'm really tempted to open up for another round of questions, but I had asked each of the panelists, as we look into this quite terrifying year that we find ourselves in, full of risk, full of violence, full of the erosion of all of the norms that we've sort of believed in to some extent our whole lives. Could you highlight for us one big risk you see as we go into this year, one thing that's keeping you awake at night, and find in all of the darkness for us one reason for optimism? So Nadine, we'll start with you and go down the panel.
So I believe the risk is we would be filling within the communities the possibilities for them to be self-reliant. Again, COVID, they were able, frontliners were able, local and national actors were able to support communities, were listening because there was trust and because they were well-resourced. Down the line, 5 years ahead, will we still have some local and national actors who are well-resourced to be able to respond to any crisis that emerge? That's the risk. In terms of optimism, most of the advances I've seen in terms of localization or changing within the system have been intentional. they didn't come from systems. They came from people who were convinced and pushing for that. So I am hoping that regardless of, just talking and not working on that talk, I'm hoping that we will see more and more people embracing this intentionality and pushing it and putting it to practice. I don't know if it's a wishful thinking, but I'm hoping.
No, I share that hope. I don't think it's wishful thinking. Lucy, we'll turn to you. One fear, one reason for optimism.
I guess the fear is individualism reigns supreme, and we all operate as individuals, thinking about us and ourselves and our organizations, and the imperative of the organizational survival over the bigger system and the people that it is intended to serve, which are the people actually affected and at risk of crises. I guess optimism is the people. I think ultimately people come into the sector with the intention of doing good and helping others. And fundamentally, maybe we all just need to do a bit of a self-audit for whether we're actually doing that or not. And I think if we can be self-aware enough, then I have a lot of optimism just in the people.
Thank you. Gloria, turning to you.
Well, I think for me, the biggest risk I see is that as humanitarians, we always want to create new things out of nothing. So my fear is that because there's mutual aid happening, we may decide one morning to wake up and say we want to create a new sector. So mine is just a caution that we shouldn't get there. Allow things be as they are. Allow mutual aid to prosper within these communities as it is. We don't need your PhDs. Kindly just allow us to do it the way we know it, right? For me, I think what I'm optimistic about is the current pleasure I get as a local actor, working really within my community and seeing us shape priorities, shape our own development agenda, and taking that ownership and running with it, despite a failing government, despite a failing humanitarian architecture in my context. So for me, I think the sense of the accountability aspect and the ultimate fact that we're leading this by ourselves towards our own recovery and resilience give me a lot of hope.
And Federico, last but not least, one fear, one reason for hope.
I mean, I think it would be remiss to not mention the fact that ultimately, I think my fear is perverse incentives, demonstrated by, I think, what the United States has done with the $2 billion allocation. We were just seeing everything revert to the lowest common denominator, the easy option. I mean, to some degree, the thing that we know how to do, and it's basically ignoring everything else. I mean, how much of that funding I want to see at the end of the day will go to local actors directly? How much of it will respond to demand-led requirements? I fear probably nil or close to that, so the usual 1%, 2%. So that's my fear. I mean, I think that ultimately the perverse incentives will drive our decision-making because they are very good incentives in a sense, right? Like it solves the problem. But I think the reason to be optimistic is that we are seeing quite a lot happen. I think there are so many examples where, again, I want to emphasize this, where we have failed, really good examples have come up from outside of our models that we now need to pay attention to and just figure out, again, what is our role around that? How do we support it without smothering it? How do we engage with it, again, from a demand-led perspective? How do we also bring in people who need to be part of the conversation today, but who might not action until like a few years from now? So like, where are the International Development Corporation or IFCs, multilateral development banks? Have them part of the conversation today, demand them to be at the table. Because ultimately they're going to be footing the bill for what comes next, right? I mean, the transition has to happen, and And so, yeah, like as much as we can, if we, the optimism comes from like recognizing that if we build parallel systems, we're not going to get anywhere. So sort of thinking within everything that someone else has said, like how do we ingrain, keep ourselves out of it, but still provide that support. And I think there are really good examples of how that's working.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I have been hanging on every single word. I think what you said today has been so powerful and so important. 4 promises that I have made to myself based on what you've all talked today. The first is to check myself every time I find myself in a conversation where we're really focused on the financial aspect of this crisis. Nadine, I completely agree with you. This is a political crisis with deep and multiple roots, and we need to be serious about that and engage with that and not just think about the symptoms. The second, Federico, to your point, is every time I get swept up in a conversation about small reshuffles to this system of ours that we'll be discussing a lot in these rooms over the coming days, to remind myself that the change that's needed is exactly the one that you and Gloria have set out. Let's figure out what it is communities need, what they prioritize, what they're doing, and organize all global solidarity, all resources around that. That's the change we need. Anything else is just rearranging deck chairs. The third is this reminder that I think we've heard from all of you today, that sometimes the most important thing the humanitarian system can do, the most important thing we can do, is get out of the way and have a bit of a humility check about the role of the UN-led humanitarian system in the future global solidarity system. And the fourth point I've heard on this panel, I'm also stealing it from a panel last week. This came, by the way, from a major bilateral donor. So when he said it, you couldn't hear a thing in the room, is about every time we have a conversation about risk, Louisa, to your point about compliance being raised as a barrier, Gloria, as you said, to remember the risk of staying put, to remember the risk of continuing as we're currently operating, the risk of funding organizations who are unable to deliver in the places that they need most, and try and reorient that conversation around risk to the risks matter. So those are my resolutions coming out of this panel. A huge, huge thank you to all of our speakers today. Really have loved everything that you said. A huge thank you to all of you in the room for making time. We're finishing a couple of minutes early, so please do take advantage of that time to grab our speakers and ask them all of your questions on the way out. But a huge thank you from me. Thanks to all our speakers.
Thank you.